So, Max, I was playing around with this new LLM last night, and it kept giving me these weird tokens that were supposed to help with reasoning.
Let me guess, it looked like it was thinking deeply, but was actually just taking shortcuts.
Exactly. It's like the model was pretending to reason when it was really just pattern matching. How did you know?
Because that's exactly what today's paper is about. These latent tokens might not be the reasoning breakthrough we thought they were.
Welcome to another episode of Totally Unprofessional Peer Review. I'm Casey Park, a developer who cares deeply about structure and flow in AI systems.
And I'm Max Stone, coming at this from a theorist perspective with a focus on metrics and methodology. Today we're diving into some fascinating research about latent tokens in large language models.
That's right, we're looking at a paper titled Do Latent Tokens Think? A causal and adversarial analysis of chain of continuous thought. It's examining whether these hidden tokens in models like Coconut are actually performing reasoning or just creating an illusion of thought.
This paper really challenges our assumptions about what's happening under the hood. The researchers did some clever steering experiments and found that these latent tokens might be more like empty placeholders than actual reasoning steps.
Which is pretty concerning when you think about it. If these models are just exploiting dataset artifacts rather than truly reasoning,
It means we might be overestimating how much progress we've actually made in AI reasoning capabilities.
exactly. And get this, the paper shows that while these latent token approaches might score well on benchmarks, they're basically just finding clever shortcuts instead of solving problems the way we think they are.
It's like hiring someone who aces the interview by memorizing answers but can't actually do the job.
Perfect analogy. So today we're going to break down how these researchers uncovered this illusion of reasoning, what it means for language models, and why we should all care about whether our AI systems are actually thinking or just pretending to.
And trust me, after hearing what they discovered about these so-called thinking tokens, you might never look at your chatbot the same way again.
All right, let's dig into what these latent tokens actually are. The paper focuses on something called chain of continuous thought, or COCO-NUT, which is a relatively new approach to reasoning in language models.
Right, and to understand why this matters, we should first explain the difference between traditional chain of thought prompting and this COCO-NUT approach.
Let's look at this comparison the researchers provide. It really illustrates the fundamental difference.
This is fascinating. On the left, we see traditional chain of thought, or COT, where the model explicitly writes out its reasoning steps in plain English that humans can read and understand.
And on the right is COCO-NUT, which replaces those explicit reasoning steps with what the paper calls latent tokens, essentially placeholders that aren't meant to be human readable. The model is supposed to use these tokens for internal reasoning.
What's interesting is that both approaches are trying to solve the same problem, helping language models reason better, but they take fundamentally different paths.
Exactly. The traditional COT approach says, let's make the model show its work explicitly, while COCO-NUT says, let's give the model space to think in its own language. The big question this paper asks is whether those latent tokens are actually encoding meaningful reasoning or just creating the illusion of it.
And that's where things get interesting. The paper defines COCO-NUT as a process where the input X leads to Z, which is a sequence of latent tokens which then leads to output Y. These latent tokens are supposed to function as placeholders for reasoning.
Right, but unlike COT, these latent tokens are trained to facilitate output alignment without explicit semantic grounding. In human terms, that means they're optimized to help the model get to the right answer, but they don't necessarily represent actual reasoning steps that would make sense to us.
Let's look at another visualization from the paper that really drives this point home.
This is a 3D PCA visualization showing how latent tokens compare to regular vocabulary tokens in the embedding space. The blue dots are latent tokens, and the red dots are vocabulary tokens.
What's striking here is how different the latent tokens are from regular vocabulary. In panel A, we see the input embeddings before any processing. But in panels B and C, we see what happens to those latent tokens after coconut reasoning. They're completely separated from the vocabulary tokens and clustered together.
And that clustering pattern is exactly what the researchers point to as evidence that these tokens are functioning as placeholders rather than meaningful representations of reasoning. They're structurally and semantically chaotic from the model's perspective.
The paper also looked at how these different types of tokens respond to perturbation, basically messing with them to see what happens. Let's take another look at that first figure to understand their experimental approach.
Right, so in the bottom part of this figure, we can see they're doing what they call layer-wise perturbation on the reasoning trace. They're intentionally altering parts of the reasoning process to see how it affects the final output.
And what they found was pretty telling. When they messed with the Co-T tokens, the explicit reasoning steps, the model's output changed dramatically. The accuracy dropped and there was a high inconsistency rate of 52.8%.
But with Coconut, the story was completely different. When they perturbed the latent tokens, the model's accuracy remained stable and the inconsistency rate was only 17.9%. That suggests these latent tokens aren't actually influencing the final prediction very much.
Which is a big red flag. If these tokens were truly encoding reasoning steps, messing with them should mess with the final answer. The fact that it doesn't suggests they're not actually critical to the reasoning process.
Let's also look at how these tokens evolve through the layers of a model. The researchers did some interesting analysis there too.
This figure shows PCA projections of token embeddings across different layers of the LLMA 38B instruct model, comparing malicious and safe instructions. You can see how the representations evolve from layer 1 to layer 24.
And what's interesting is that by the later layers, there's a clear separation between malicious and safe content. This suggests the model is developing meaningful representations for content safety, which contrasts with how the latent tokens behave.
So to summarize what we've learned about these latent tokens, they're clustered together in embedding space, they're minimally sensitive to perturbation, and they appear to be optimized for output alignment rather than representing actual reasoning steps.
Exactly. The paper concludes that these latent tokens are primarily serving as placeholders rather than encoding faithful reasoning. They're not interpretable in any meaningful way.
Which raises an important question. If these tokens aren't actually reasoning, what are they doing? And why might they still lead to improved performance on benchmarks?
That's the million-dollar question, and it leads directly into our next section, where we'll explore how Coconut might be exploiting dataset artifacts instead of performing true reasoning.
It's like the difference between a student who shows their work on a math problem versus one who just writes down the answer and claims they did the calculation in their head.
And when the teacher asks that student to explain their mental process, they just say latent token, latent token, latent token, and expect full credit.
Ha ha ha, exactly. And surprisingly, they might still get the right answer, but not because they're reasoning correctly.
Now let's dive into the real meat of this paper, the experimental analysis. The researchers designed some clever experiments to test whether these latent tokens are actually doing what they claim to do.
Right, they called these steering experiments, basically ways to poke and prod at the tokens to see how they respond. The idea is brilliantly simple. If these tokens truly encode reasoning steps, then messing with them should change the model's output in predictable ways.
Let's take another look at that figure from earlier to understand their approach better.
So in this diagram, we can see they're applying what they call layer-wise perturbation to the reasoning trace. They're essentially making small controlled changes to the token representations as they flow through the model's layers.
And they did this for both traditional COTI tokens and Coconut's latent tokens, right? To compare how each responds to these interventions?
Exactly. They formulated this as a hypothesis. If Coconut latent tokens faithfully encode internal reasoning, then targeted perturbations to these tokens should meaningfully influence the model's final outputs.
That makes sense. If these tokens are actually doing reasoning, then changing them should change the reasoning outcome. So what did they find?
They used two main types of interventions. First, perturbations, where they applied controlled changes to token representations in the hidden space. And second, swapping, where they exchanged tokens across different inputs.
And to measure the effect of these interventions, they introduced something called the perturbation success rate, or PSR, right?
That's right. The PSR measures how often their perturbations successfully change the model's output in the intended way. Let's look at the table showing these results.
Wow, this is striking. For the Llama 3.8b model, perturbing the CoTen tokens resulted in a 50% success rate, but perturbing the coconut tokens only had a 5% success rate.
And it's consistent across different models. All Llama 27b shows an even bigger gap, 57.92% for Cote versus just 4.17% for Coconut. That's more than a 10x difference.
And look at Falcon 37b. Perturbing coconut tokens had literally zero effect. The PSR is 0%.
This is really telling. If these latent tokens were actually encoding meaningful reasoning steps, we'd expect them to be at least somewhat sensitive to perturbation.
They also looked at more detailed metrics beyond just success rates. Let's check out this table with the toxicity scores.
This table shows the toxicity scores before and after perturbation. For Ultima 38b, perturbing CoT tokens changed the toxicity score from 26 1.81 to 100 9.96, a massive increase.
But for coconut, the toxicity barely budged from 30.19 to just 3.75 saw 0.26. That's practically no change at all.
And we see the same pattern across all the models they tested. The CoT tokens are highly sensitive to perturbation, while the coconut tokens barely respond.
The researchers also tried a different experiment, token swapping. Instead of perturbing tokens, they swapped tokens between different samples to see how it affected accuracy.
Right, and the results from that experiment are equally telling. Let's look at this table.
So before swapping, both Coty and Coconut had similar accuracy, 62.8% for Coty and 60.9% for Coconut, but after swapping tokens between samples, Coty's accuracy dropped to 43.4%, while Coconut stayed almost the same at 61%.
And look at the inconsistency rate, 52.8% for Coty versus just 17.9% for Coconut. That means when they swapped Coty tokens, the model's answers changed more than half the time.
But with Coconut, swapping tokens only changed the answers about 18% of the time. That's a huge difference.
So what does all this tell us? Well, if these latent tokens were actually encoding reasoning steps, they should be sensitive to these kinds of interventions. The fact that they're not suggests they're not actually doing what they claim to do.
It's like the model is putting on a show of reasoning without actually going through the steps. The latent tokens are more like placeholders than actual reasoning steps.
Exactly. The paper concludes that coconut tokens are pseudo-reasoning placeholders rather than faithful internal traces. They don't encode the critical information needed for reasoning.
Which is fascinating because Coconut still performs well on benchmarks. So it's doing something right, just not what we thought it was doing.
Right. And that leads us to the next big question. If these tokens aren't encoding reasoning steps, what are they actually doing? How is Coconut achieving good performance without true reasoning?
It's like watching a magician. You know there's a trick, but you can't quite figure out how it's done.
Great analogy. And just like with magic tricks, once you know how it's done, it's a lot less impressive. The researchers found that Coconut is basically exploiting dataset artifacts rather than performing genuine reasoning.
Which brings us to our next section, how Coconut exploits these dataset artifacts to achieve good performance without actually reasoning. But before we move on, Let's summarize what we've learned from these steering experiments.
The key takeaway is that coconut tokens are remarkably resistant to perturbation and swapping, which suggests they're not encoding the critical information needed for reasoning. They're more like empty placeholders than actual reasoning steps.
And this resistance to perturbation is consistent across multiple models and experimental setups, which strengthens the conclusion that these latent tokens aren't doing what they claim to do.
It's a bit like discovering that someone you thought was a chess grandmaster was actually just memorizing moves rather than understanding strategy. They might win games, but not because they understand chess.
Perfect analogy. And just like that chess player might struggle when faced with novel situations, we might expect Coconut to struggle when faced with problems that require genuine reasoning rather than pattern matching.
Which is exactly what we'll explore next. How coconut performs in settings designed to test true reasoning versus shortcut exploitation.
So now we get to the really interesting part. If Coconut isn't actually doing reasoning with these latent tokens, then what exactly is it doing? How is it still performing well on benchmarks?
That's the million-dollar question. The researchers designed what they called shortcut experiments to investigate this. The basic hypothesis was, if coconut primarily exploits superficial shortcuts rather than true reasoning, then its predictions should fail under out-of-distribution or adversarially designed conditions.
Right, and by shortcuts, we mean the model is using patterns or artifacts in the dataset to predict answers, rather than actually understanding and reasoning through the problem.
Exactly. Let's look at how they set up these experiments. They created two types of shortcut interventions to test this hypothesis.
This figure is really illuminating. They tested on two datasets, MMLU, which is a multiple choice benchmark, and Hotpot QA, which requires multi-hop reasoning.
For MMLU, they did something really clever. In the training set, they biased the distribution of correct answers so that about 75% of correct answers were option C. Then they evaluated on a test set with the original uniform distribution.
I see that in the top example. The training question about the Pleiades star cluster has C as the correct answer, which fits into their bias distribution where 75% of answers are C. Then the evaluation question about intracellular buffers has A as the correct answer, following the original distribution.
And for Hotpot QA, they did something different but equally clever. They injected irrelevant context into the training examples, information that's related to the topic but doesn't actually help answer the question.
Right, like in this example about Wayne's World, they included information about Second City Theater, which is the correct answer, but also added irrelevant information about Akhmat Arena and Chris Farley.
The key insight here is that they're creating artificial shortcuts in the training data to see if the model will exploit them rather than actually reasoning through the problems.
And what did they find? Did Coconut take the bait?
Unfortunately, yes. Let's look at the results they got.
Wow, these graphs tell quite a story. Looking at panel B for MMLU, we can see that when trained on the manipulated dataset where most answers are C, the model starts choosing C for incorrect answers about 70% of the time.
Compare that to the original model, which only chooses C for incorrect answers about 30% of the time. That's a huge difference and strong evidence that Coconut is learning to exploit the pattern rather than reason through the problems.
And the Hotpot QA results in panels C and D are even more dramatic. When trained with shortcuts, the model's accuracy drops from about 65% to just 13% on the original test set without shortcuts.
But look what happens when they test on examples where the shortcuts favor the correct answer. Accuracy shoots up to nearly 100%. And when shortcuts favor incorrect answers, accuracy plummets to almost 0%.
That's incredibly telling. It means the model is basically ignoring the actual reasoning required and just following the shortcuts.
And look at panel D. It shows how the fraction of incorrect answers that follow the shortcut changes over training epochs. After just one epoch, it's around 20%, but by the second epoch, it jumps to nearly 100%.
That timing is significant, right? Because Coconut gradually introduces latent tokens during training, with the first epoch reflecting pure COTI reasoning and subsequent epochs incorporating latent tokens.
Exactly. That sharp increase in shortcut driven errors right after enabling latent tokens suggests that Coconut specifically encourages shortcut reliance rather than genuine reasoning.
So, to summarize what we're seeing, when Coconut is trained on data with artificial shortcuts, it quickly learns to exploit those shortcuts rather than developing true reasoning capabilities.
And this happens because training in Coconut optimizes for final answer consistency. The latent tokens end up encoding correlations that minimize loss most efficiently, which often means exploiting spurious patterns rather than developing structured reasoning.
This is really concerning for AI safety and reliability. If models are taking shortcuts rather than reasoning, they might perform well on benchmarks but fail catastrophically in real world scenarios where those shortcuts don't exist.
Absolutely. It's like a student who memorizes answers to past exam questions without understanding the underlying principles. They might ace the test if the same questions appear, but they'll struggle with new problems that require actual understanding.
And what's particularly concerning is that these shortcut behaviors are harder to detect with Coconut compared to traditional COTI because the reasoning is hidden in these latent tokens that we can't interpret.
Right. With explicit COT, we can at least read the reasoning steps and identify flaws or shortcuts, but with Coconut, those shortcuts are hidden in the latent tokens, making them much harder to detect and correct.
It's like the difference between a student showing their work versus just writing down an answer and claiming they did the calculation in their head. If they show their work, we can see where they went wrong. But if they just give an answer, we have no idea if they actually understand the problem or just got lucky.
And in this case, the student isn't even doing the calculation in their head. They're just looking at patterns like the answer is usually C, or the answer is usually mentioned in the first paragraph.
Exactly. And to be fair, the researchers note that they didn't conduct a deeper investigation into why Coconut relies on shortcuts. Their analysis remains somewhat speculative.
That's true, but the evidence they present is pretty compelling. The dramatic differences in performance when shortcuts are introduced strongly suggest that Coconut is exploiting dataset artifacts rather than performing true reasoning.
And this has broader implications for how we evaluate language models. If models can achieve high accuracy on benchmarks by exploiting shortcuts rather than reasoning, then those benchmarks might not be measuring what we think they're measuring.
Absolutely. This paper is a wake-up call for the field. It suggests we need to be much more careful about how we evaluate reasoning capabilities in language models and more skeptical of approaches that claim to improve reasoning without providing interpretable evidence of how they're doing it.
So, to wrap up this section, Coconut's latent tokens don't encode faithful reasoning steps. Instead, they function as placeholders that allow the model to exploit shortcuts and dataset artifacts, leading to inflated performance on benchmarks without true reasoning capabilities.
And while Coconut might converge faster during training, its performance is less stable across tasks and heavily dependent on the presence of exploitable patterns in the data. This makes it less reliable for real-world applications where such patterns might not exist or might change over time.
It's a fascinating study that really challenges our assumptions about what's happening under the hood in these language models, and it highlights the importance of transparency and interpretability in AI systems.
Definitely. As we move toward more complex AI systems, we need to ensure they're actually reasoning in ways we can understand and verify, not just exploiting shortcuts that might break in unexpected ways.
Well, Max, I think we've thoroughly pulled back the curtain on these so called thinking tokens. They're less like actual reasoning and more like a student who memorized the teacher's answer key.
Absolutely. This research is a great reminder that we need to be skeptical of black box approaches to AI reasoning. Just because a model gets the right answer doesn't mean it's thinking the way we think it's thinking.
And that's what makes this field so fascinating. We're constantly discovering that our AI systems are both more impressive and less intelligent than they appear on the surface.
That's a perfect way to put it. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Totally Unprofessional Peer Review. Remember to check our show notes for links to the original paper.
And join us next week when we'll be discussing a new paper on multimodal learning systems.
Until then, remember, your AI might be giving you all the right answers, but that doesn't mean it's doing any of the right thinking.